Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this third sweet instalment of our online seminar series, What's Your Poison?, organised by the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces. Today, of course, is sugar, and we're delighted to have with us as our speaker, Mimi Goodall. Mimi is a fourth-year DPhil student at the University of Oxford, an economic and social historian of the early modern Atlantic world. Her thesis, which is called Sugar in the Early British Atlantic, explores how people bought and ate sugar in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Drawing on a wide range of new archival sources and blending quantitative and qualitative analysis, the project revises the chronology of the sugar trade, arguing that it was far more extensive and developed by 1700 than has hitherto been recognised. It reframes the discussion of the development of international economic systems, early forms of capitalist exchange, burgeoning industrialisation, and above all, the reliance of the metropolitan economic development on exploitation in the colonies. And I heard Mimi present a different aspect of her work at the IHR Food History Seminar in the before times, and thought, we have to get her. And we have. So before we get going, our usual spot of housekeeping, Mimi will speak for around half an hour, and then there will be around half an hour for questions and discussion. There is a little chat feature in the bottom right, which I see some of you are already using. Do post constructive things there throughout the talk. However, if you have a question for Mimi, please post it using the separate Ask a Question button at the bottom, and you can put these in as they occur to you or save them for the Q&A. Just type out your question if you want me to ventriloquize it for you. But if you'd rather ask it yourself, just put question or something to that effect, and I'll see if I can get you onto the screen. But do be aware the event is being recorded. So without further ado, it gives me huge pleasure to turn things over to Mimi and sugar refining in England, 1650 to 1700.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here, for taking time out of your lunch, or I see people from America, so for your breakfast maybe, and I hope you enjoy what I have to say, and I really look forward to hearing questions and comments. I'm writing up at the moment, so any new ideas are kind of very welcome. Let me just share my screen so that you have my presentation, and then I will begin. Okay. So, sugar refining in England, 1650 to 1700, as I'm sure you're all well aware of. In the 17th century, English ports were busy. It's my hope that the two images on the screen capture the sense of this vibrant hustle and bustle. Boats slowly making their way up to the wharf, their hulls stuffed with cargo from all over the world. The shore thronging with people, a mix of rich and poor, merchants anxiously awaiting their goods, hoping perhaps that they had survived the journey across the seas, strong men primed to unload the boxes and barrels, customs officials ready to inspect the goods and to value their taxation appropriately, paupers hoping perhaps to catch a spare morsel or a scrap of food, or shipwrights anticipating new business. Let's now focus on the idea of one imaginative 17th century ship in particular. We can envision perhaps it's making its way slowly and stately way into port. We might imagine its sailors have travelled from Barbados and have arrived in London, a thriving entrepot by the end of the century. The ship would have carried inside it large barrels of sugar, which, as you know, will be the subject of this paper. But as well as that, a veritable cornucopia of other goods, spices like ginger and pepper, as well as cottons, wine, beeswax, and even, if the port documents are to be believed, elephant's teeth. The crew, weather-beaten, perhaps a little homesick, and perhaps a little bored of their monotonous rations, would have had their eyes fixed on the shore, desperate for dry land and a meal with more variety than stale biscuit. During an allocated time slot, the ship would have crawled up the Thames to the Billingsgate Quay on the north side of the river, and the sailors, on descending the ship, would have been flung into the melee I described earlier, and their five senses assaulted. Ears would have been pierced with a cacophony of cries, those of street sellers and the harassed shouts of instructions from those accepting the cargo. Looking up, they might have gazed on the imposing customs house designed by Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London, Unburdening the ship of her contents, their hands would have rubbed the rough wood of the barrels. And every so often, perhaps these men would have wiped their hands on their clothes as they grew ever stickier. Sugar barrels were wont to leak their contents. A variety of smells would also have reached the sailors' nostrils. The most powerful would probably have been the pungent smell of fish sold at the market nearby, but others would have cut through too. On the wind, these men might have caught a whiff of the exotic spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, which had escaped from their containers, and the sugar itself would emanate a rich and fruity scent, especially the molasses, which is the kind of treacle that is shipped with sugar, and the semi-processed muscovado sugar, which is the dark brown sugar that you can still buy today. And if the seamen had breathed in deeply, perhaps out of exertion, the suggestion of smoke would have met them. A few streets over, the sugar refineries would have been aglow, burning coal to boil the sticky brown sugar in the huge copper vats and transforming it into highly prized white refined sugar. And it's this activity with which today's presentation is concerned: sugar imports and their subsequent refining. Take a look on the image to the image on your left. We see a customs man at the bottom, and I'll just highlight who he is. A customs man in a bright blue coat, leaning intently on a barrel to take note of the imports. His interlocutors looking less than enthusiastic about the discussion, however. One has his hand shoved defensively in pockets, while the other leans insolently on a barrel, chewing on a pipe of tobacco. These customs men, this man in the bright blue coat, provide the source material for my arguments here. As the goods came into port, these men and this man and his colleague would have taken note of the weight and value of the goods and used the figures to calculate the appropriate taxation rate, as well, and then feed these figures into calculating the nation's balance of trade. The men's records survive in the form of two sets of manuscripts, familiar to many economic historians: the Book of Tables found in the British Library and the Inspector General's ledgers, which are in the National Archives at Kew. And these date from the 1660s and the 1690s, respectively. These manuscripts record imports and exports through London and England, and they are the only extant official national trade statistics for the 17th century. And the records have been used extensively in previous scholarship, but here and in the rest of my thesis, I turn to them anew and recalculate the figures for trade in sugar. And I use these recalculations to make a specific intervention into our understanding of 17th century trade in and consumption of sugar. And today, using the import figures, I'll examine the growth of the sugar refining industry in England during the 17th century. Over this period, the type of sugar being imported changed. The country imported less refined white sugar, but more unrefined brown sugar, which tradesmen would then refine domestically. As such, by the end of the century, sugar had changed from a luxury import to a domestic manufacture. And from this, I argue that the sugar industry was therefore part of nascent industrialisation in the country. What are the repercussions of this argument? Well, I demonstrate how the good produced by enslaved people on colonial Caribbean plantations made a contribution to the metropolitan economic environment. By looking at 17th century domestic sugar refining in detail, I shed light on the industrial activity to which slavery and the products of enslaved labour made an essential contribution. While not a factory, a sugar refinery was the sort of energy-intensive industry which provided a model for later industrial practices. And this new understanding of the economic role of sugar refineries contributes to the current discussion of Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, which was first published in 1944. And so when I say it's a current discussion, it's actually been an ongoing discussion since its publication. Understood broadly, Williams's thesis argues for the importance of slavery to British economic development. And Williams did discuss sugar refining in Capitalism and Slavery. However, he dated it to the 18th century. Here, I reframe the chronology of the industry, demonstrating that it was much more widespread by 1700 than Williams allowed for, and had wide-ranging economic effects which spread across the country, even at a very early date. But before I get into the sugar imports and domestic refining, and specifically in the 17th century, it's perhaps useful to know how one actually goes about refining sugar more generally. This process did begin on the plantation, and the image on the left of your slide is taken from a book of Brazilian medicine written by the Dutch naturalist Willem Piso, and it gives an indication of how sugarcane juice was boiled repeatedly and then turned into processed crystals. And as much as probably most of you know, sugar was grown as a cane, and then this cane is hacked down and it's thread through mills, which extracts its juice. The cane juice needs to be boiled almost immediately, otherwise it turns sour and kind of goes off. And so what happened is that the cane was fed through a series of clarifying copper stills and boiled in each one. And at each point when it's boiling, scum is removed. And you can see the men are removing the scum here. And at every single stage, it gets purer and purer. And eventually, after it's been through these 4 copper stills and cooled, the liquid is siphoned off and poured into inverted pots, which you can see in this picture on your right. And so it's poured into inverted pots, and these pots have a hole in the bottom. And as the sugar cools and crystallizes, molasses, the dark sticky treacle I mentioned earlier, goes into the bottom of the pots, and the sugar is in a kind of cone shape. And after a month, the heavy, wet brown sugar is taken out. The pots are taken out of, and they're taken to this knocking room and knocked out of their pots into, and then they're shipped and sold when they reach their eventual location. Some white sugar is also made on the islands, and the different way of doing this is just that a layer of a clay-like substance is put on top of the brown sugar, which travels through along with the molasses, and this purifies the sugar even more, so that the remaining cone is much whiter. And this is also packaged and shipped back to Europe. But not all refining took place on the plantation. The first stages of processing did have to be done close to the cane fields in order to stop the cane from spoiling. But sugar at various stages of refinement was shipped to Europe. It was then refined further domestically using the same or indeed similar techniques. And the direction of information flows, and this is just kind of an aside around this, are interesting and should be noted. This isn't a scientific industrial process which is kind of originates in the metropole and then gets exported to the colony. Rather, knowledge flows in a much more circuitous way. The process of boiling sugar was developed, indeed one might say refined, in the colonies, mostly in Dutch and Portuguese Brazil, and then the knowledge is fed back to the European metropole. But I now want to turn to the trade statistics I mentioned earlier, the Book of Tables and the Inspector General's ledgers, dating from the 1660s and the 1690s respectively. Tracing the instances of sugar in these account books can give us 2 snapshots of the state of the sugar trade, firstly in the mid-century and then again at its end. And read together, we have a sense of how the industry changed over this time period. So on your screen now is a table documenting the breakdown of sugar imports and exports in these 2 time periods. And I just want to make it clear that you should just look at the top row of the imports, because I'm not talking about imports and exports and re-exports. But if you'd like to know much more about foreign trade, please ask me that in the question time. And there are 2 key things that I want you to take away from these numbers. Firstly, that the amount of sugar being imported into England goes up substantially over this period. So you can see in the first column, this one here on your left, that only in 100 weights, 1,000 hundredweights, 33,000 hundredweights of white sugar was coming in, 150 of brown sugar was coming in, and then later on it goes up to 430. And then there's also some molasses and some white sugar that comes in. So there's a huge growth over this period. That's kind of expected. We know that the industry is developing. But the second thing, and the thing I want to really emphasize here, is that the amount of brown sugar goes up, yes, but the amount of white sugar goes down. So you can see in the earlier period, 33,000 hundredweights is coming in, and that drops to 18.7. And so looking at these import figures, we can see that over the second half of the 17th century, the type of sugar imported into England changed. More and more semi-processed brown sugar came into the ports and less white sugar did. And this is true for the pure volumes of sugar coming in, but brown sugar also commands a greater percentage of the trade. So these pie charts are showing how the percentage makeup of the trade changed. So in London, you can see in the 1660s, 80% is brown sugar and 18% is white sugar. By this has gone up to 88% brown sugar and has dropped to 3.83% white sugar. So it has almost no white sugar by the end. And then the blue is the molasses, which kind of gets imported as well. And so this deep brown muscovado sugar, which arrived in England, which would then need to be processed further. So the gold stuff coming in on this pie chart has to be processed, and in order to turn it into white sugar, which is desirable to consumers. And the mercantilist tariff policy of the state, the English state, the Navigation Acts, encouraged this domestic industry with its preferential taxation rates. What the Navigation Acts dictate is that custom tax on unrefined brown sugar from British Caribbean islands was much lower than that for refined sugars. So it's cheaper to import brown sugar. Once we know that more brown sugar was entering the ports, we can start to think about what happened to it once it arrived in the country and what the consequences were for the economy as a whole. As you might expect, increasing the amount of brown sugar or imported brown sugar meant an increase of refineries up and down the country. By 1700, England and the rest of the British Isles were host to at least 51 refineries. And the map and the table here show all the locations. London remained the central location with more refineries than any other city. The poll tax records for 1692 record 16 refineries in the city, most situated near to the customs quay. And other records show that areas on the outskirts of the city were also home to at least 6 businesses, including ones in Battersea and Vauxhall. However, London's early leadership was not so comprehensive as to overshadow the growth of the industry elsewhere. There were other factors which encouraged expansion across the country, often at times when London was struggling. When plague hit the capital in the 1660s, the intra-city trade slowed down. So London's ability to ship goods to the rest of the country decreases. And actually, so does international trade in and out of the country, out of the capital. So, because of quarantine measures, which obviously we're all familiar with, fewer ships were coming into London and leaving London. So, ships bound for London were instead forced to dock in Liverpool. The Liverpool port books for 1665 make note of a London-bound ship from Barbados, which had to divert its course to Liverpool and offload its cargo there as a result of plague in the capital. As Maura Duggan suggests, such activity, quote, might have alerted Liverpool merchants to the opportunities of trading with the West Indies. The red dots on the map demonstrate the path the industry traced up the edges of the country. As might be expected, these sugar houses remained close to coasts and major waterways, but they did cover the length and breadth of the island. Sugar refineries in England were built as far south as Plymouth, as far north as York, as west as Liverpool, and as east as Ipswich. And if we include Scotland, obviously Scotland and Ireland, there are refineries in Glasgow and there are refineries in Belfast and Cork. The flourishing refining industry pulled a number of economic actors together right across the country. And it's at this point where we can think most expansively about the effect of the sugar trade on the domestic economy. And the images on the screen now are taken from the Dutch emblem book, the Book of Trades. The volume, created by Jan Luyken and his son Caspar in 1694, depicts a variety of trades prevalent in Amsterdam in the 17th century. 4 of the images are extremely useful for our understanding of the importance of sugar refining. While most obviously relevant to the Dutch economy, the similarities between the two countries mean that the pictures can also help us to understand sugar in England. Most importantly, we see the sugarbaker, and I apologise for my Dutch pronunciation during the rest of this talk, or the sugar baker himself. He holds in his arms a great loaf of sugar, recently slid from its mould. His workers wash linens in the canal in the background, while another carries another loaf inside. And the familiar chests in which the more expensive sugar was carried can be seen just on the bottom in the foreground, and also on the shop sign just up here. It's the other three slides, the other three pictures, however, the Cooperslager and the Pastebäcker, the cooper, the coppersmith, and the pastry maker, which speak more to the ripple effect sugar had on the rest of the economy. Sugar and sugar refining, as I've said, demanded copper stills, which needed to be heated by large amounts of coal. Once the sugar was refined, it needed to be stored in barrels and hogsheads and chests, and it also needed to be transported to its final point of sale. And sometimes it was transfigured even further into delicious cakes and pastries. And all of these processes required the involvement of other tradespeople and their expertise. So for the remainder of the talk, I want to turn to each of them briefly and begin with copper, and to explore how sugar and sugar refining encouraged these trades. And I'll illustrate these ideas with a few examples. So I begin with copper. Copper was the cheapest metal, which had both a high melting point and a high conductivity, and this meant that it was an appealing choice for sugar refiners. There was always the chance that sugar, when boiled, would burn and ruin, but copper's properties helped to mitigate that risk. By the end of the century, sugar was often boiled in large copper stills, the kind of which you can see the two men beating into shape in the back of the workshop. Nuala Zahadiah has traced the importance of sugar refining for the copper export trade, and she traces the effects of the increasing demand for British manufactured copper stills in the British Caribbean islands from 1680 to 1730, so around the same time that I'm talking about. These exported copper stills would have been vital parts of the process of turning cane juice into semi-processed muscovados in the islands themselves, and they are thought to have revivified, and demand for these stills in the Caribbean is thought to have revivified a dying domestic copper trade. However, I argue that copper was also increasingly used by domestic refiners in England. An account book from a refinery in Ipswich dating from 1617 does not record copper utensils. Rather, it appears to use lead ones instead. However, by the 1690s, copper is being used by domestic refiners as well. An inventory of the Whitson Court Sugar House in Bristol, drawn up in 1690, records 3 copper pans worth £31, 16 shillings, and 3 copper coolers worth £9, 15 shillings, as well as a variety of copper ladles and pipes and funnels, all of which were used in the refining process. And one of the reasons why these copper stills could be used so easily in domestic refining practices, and they weren't earlier when lead was being used, was because over the 17th century, a new way of smelting copper was kind of invented, or at least discovered, and that was learning how to smelt it using coal, which was a kind of better way of creating these stills. And once the process had been perfected, there was a greater demand for the fuel source coal as well. So copper stills also encourage the use of coal, as did the sugar refiners themselves, because they needed large amounts of the fuel source to boil the sugars. In order to keep the sugar refining process continuous, refiners would have needed ready stocks of the fuel source of coal close to hand. In 1703, London's coal stocks were surveyed, and a sugar refiner in Southwark was found to have one of the most substantial supplies in the entire city, a remarkable 300 chaldrons or 400 tons. And it comes as no surprise, therefore, that sugar houses were often set up next to glass blowers, soap boilers, and smelters, as these industries all required coal too, and positioning them all near to each other meant that the fuel could be shipped efficiently. In Topsham, a town just south of Exeter, the sugar house was next to the glass house, and the same was the case in Gloucester. Sugar boilers formed part of a burgeoning industrial zone inside English towns. Robert Duplessis describes the creation of such an industrial zone within early modern Amsterdam as being essential to its development as a modern economy. And I argue that the creation of sugar refineries alongside these other coal-reliant industries suggests that England in the 17th century was heading the same way. Packaging and shipping the sugar also drew further economic agents into the mix. The cooper, like the one pictured here, would have made barrels to store the increasing volumes of unrefined sugar coming into England, as indicated by the port statistics. Shipping sugar around the country also encouraged evolving transport links. Eric Williams noted that the Bristol refiner Robert Aldsworth financed the construction of quays in the city's port, but transport of sugar was not just kind of limited to the immediate port environment. Sugar did not stay in the ports, but it spread inland, spread by the sweet tooth of consumers. But its spread inland was not entirely easy. For example, merchants in Lancashire, although relatively near the port city of Liverpool, found it difficult to transport goods from the port across the moorland. An obvious solution to this problem was to clear and deepen the Mersey River, which would therefore allow small boats to access Warrington and Manchester. In the 1690s, Thomas Patton of Warrington, who was a tobacco and sugar merchant, financed the removal of old fish weirs from the Mersey as far east as Warrington and cleared the path for his goods from Liverpool. The improved access to goods meant that Warrington flourished, and with this development, Patton actually decided it would be cheaper to build a refinery in Warrington itself. He would therefore be able to refine sugar in a place nearer to its eventual customers, and he wouldn't have to pay heavy import duties on importing white sugar. His sugar house complex was completed in 1717 and was seemingly successful. Daniel Defoe commented when he visited in the following decade that the sugar house, copper works, and glass houses in the town, quote, furnished the industrious with the means of living comfortably. Transport of sugar reveals that the sugar industry also had forward linkages, and it's helpful to think of the trade as a pebble dropped in water, its influence rippling out in all directions. The good was an important source of income to the grocery sector as well, which, as John Stobart has shown, flourished nationwide with the influx of new colonial foodstuffs in this period. Sugar encouraged the trade of confectioners and pastry makers, whose sugared delicacies sold across the country, some of which can be seen in the image of the Dutch pastry maker on your screen. And I think the man on your right is holding a sort of pie or a cake on his tray. By the end of the 17th century, there were at least 40 confectioners in the city of London, and again, the trade was not confined to port cities. The 1686 inventory of John Shaw, a confectioner in Chesterfield, in Derbyshire, which is about 80 miles from Liverpool, records 11 different types of sugar, valued at just under £25, which comprised about 20% of his total assets. When considered together, I'll just make sure they're all on your screen together, these four pictures from the Book of Trades help to exemplify just how powerful sugar was in bringing economic actors together across the country. And to conclude, however, I want to turn again to the ship. I begin with the picture of the English port. Dutch and English ships arrive and leave the port, making one stop on their international journeys. And what I want to show is that through sugar, we can see just how a colonial slave-produced good processed and produced many miles away changed the domestic economy. So even though there was large expanse of ocean between the islands, they have an immediate effect on one another. While the value and volume of the trade were not enormous during this period, the nascent sugar industry forged vital trading patterns and configurations which were built upon in later periods. The blossoming of the domestic refining industry, necessitated by the rise in brown sugar arriving from the colonies, was one of the first domestic sites of industrialisation, and it encouraged a number of subsidiary sectors, which I've gone over. As I said in my introduction, Eric Williams also noted the importance of the industry in capitalism and slavery, and this research definitely grows out of his initial observations. However, I argue that this phenomenon took place much earlier than has been recognised. The bulk of Williams' discussion of the growth of refining is based in the later 18th century. But the combination of the trade figures and local history employed in this paper shows sugar refining to be far more geographically extensive and much more developed earlier on. The development of sugar refineries is one of the first examples of England's growing reliance on coal and its accelerating transition to a mineral economy, which would come to characterize the Industrial Revolution 150 years later. This transition into a coal-based economy had not gone unnoticed by English citizens. The pollution worried them as it does us now. Sugar refining contributed to the smoke, sweat, and heat which fueled the complaints found in Orvietan, a long discourse on the dangers of the polluted air in London, which was written in the 1690s. By the end of the century, the city was sooty, blackened with the effluent of industry. The dirty smoke of sugar refining, moreover, was not confined to London or the southeast, but sugar was also important to the development of the northern economies. The early refineries in the Lancashire area were key components of the initial industrialisation of the north. Sugar caused rivers to be cleared, docks to be built, and coal seams to be mined right across England. Jan de Vries and Ad van der Worde make the same observation when writing about the Amsterdam refineries, which had sprung up 50 years earlier, defining them as, quote, among the first few industrial facilities that can be compared with the factories of the 19th century. The authors note the economic significance of sugar refining, commenting that it was, quote, of major importance to the city's economy because of the large investments of capital, the value of output, and the important links to foreign trade, as well as the number of persons employed. And I argue that similar trends were emerging in England. And I want to end by briefly suggesting the relevance of these points for the cotton industry, which clearly tied slavery and capitalism most tightly together in the following century or centuries. And I want to suggest ways in which cotton copied the model of the sugar trade. Through domestic sugar refining, we can see that the site of processing, the sugar refinery, was situated many miles away, oceans away from the site of production, the plantation. And this is something that was absolutely fundamental to the rise of the cotton industry and 19th century capitalism. Cotton fields were located far away from the factories which processed and transformed the fibers into clothing. And sugar exports were also part of this model, and I didn't really have time to go into them, but please ask more about the country's export trade if you're interested in the questions. Basically, England starts to export its surplus sugar, which is another way, which is another thing that it does with cotton. It exports its surplus cotton manufactures. Arguing for the importance of sugar refining and its impact on the British imperial economy and its place in the global one is not uncontroversial. Disputes about the validity of Williams's initial arguments have stimulated debate in economic history for decades, and his statements have energized, indeed catalyzed, a variety of investigations into the impact of slavery on the economy. But what I want to emphasize here is that although the volume of the sugar trade was relatively small, it speaks to the formation of economic systems and models, which were developed at a later date, and to the changing economic organization of the British Empire. In sugar refining, we see that early, indeed 17th century industrialization relied heavily on imports produced by enslaved people in the colonies. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing.
Amy, thank you so much for that incredibly sort of wide-ranging, immersive and exciting paper. I'm not going to take advantage of chair's privilege, but I think we've already got some questions lining up, so let's get to them. The first one is from Jordan Sly. Thank you, Jordan. He asks, in terms of exports, in the early period around 1663, who would have been the largest export client? And do you happen to know if these would have been existing contracts as a holdover from the protectorate period?
Yes, I do actually. Let me. I've just reading it as well. I have the export figures in at some point in front of me. If I can just. It's basically in the 1660s. It is the Dutch. They get mostly. Let me just find it. I broke them also down by exports. So actually, the white sugar mostly goes to France and to Spain and to Italy, but the molasses that they export goes to Holland. So I'm not actually sure whether they had contracts in the protectorate period, but definitely there are elements which you can see a lot of the kind of desire for internationally oriented trade, which starts off in the protectorate, kind of carrying over. So yeah, I would say I'd be interested to see whether they were actually contractual. I hadn't even thought that they might be from contracts. So, but my answer is France, Spain, Italy, and Holland. They are the places that they go to.
Great, thanks, Mimi. Jordan, I hope that answers your question. We've got a quick one here from Alexander, who asks, could you kindly repeat the reference for the research on copper imports to the Caribbean?
Yes, it is Nuala Zahediah, and that's spelled Nuala, and then I might butcher this, but Zahedieh, and it's called The Market for Inventive Activity, and it's in the Economic History, the Journal of Economic History, I think. But I can send anyone that link if they need it.
Okay, fabulous. I hope that helps Alexander. Thanks, Mimi. Marietta asks, where does sugar beet fit into the picture?
At this point, sugar beet is not being used. Sugar beet kind of comes to become a popular alternative to sugar later, in more like the late 18th century, early 19th century, when it's farmed in a different way. But all sugar from the Caribbean is sugar cane.
Lovely, thank you, Mimi. Hope that helps Marietta. Danae Tankard asks, presumably you needed a lot of capital to set up a refinery, and do you know anything about the background of the men who invested in the industry?
Yes, actually, Nuala has also worked on this as well, but I think you did need a large amount of capital, and I think that often people would have sort of, you'd have fingers in many pots, or fingers in many pies, but you would have people would be grocers who would be having a stake in a ship, who would then also import from a refinery, and often you might be a grocer who has a stake in a distillery and a refinery. So they often are these people who are sort of have links already established, and then they'll put more money into it. And you can see this especially there's a grocer's diary, William Stout of Lancaster, and he makes partnerships with different refineries over time, and you can see how these networks sort of grow up, both in the north and in London.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. I hope that answers your question. Danny, moving on. Mary Denise Smith asks if there are records for sugar molasses cargo being lost to spoilage, and did the molasses begin to ferment?
Yes, I haven't. I don't know whether it begins to ferment. Interesting. No, there's definitely a lot of stuff linked to spoilage, and what you can see is that there's a disparity between the records which show sugar leaving the islands and then the amount coming in, and it's roughly about 10%. Like if you wanted to kind of homogenize the figure, you would say that probably about 10% is lost through leakage. But people who are kind of inventive mathematicians and the economic historians sort of create new figures for this. I've sort of avoided that tactic, but people do it.
Excellent, thank you, Mimi. I hope that helps Mary Denise. Michael Bennett says thanks, Mimi, for a fascinating talk, and he asks what was the size and importance of the sugar refining industry in England prior to the huge expansion of sugar production in English colonies in the 1640s and 1650s, and he asks were sugar refiners in England during the early 17th century getting their sugar from earlier sites of production such as Brazil and the Atlantic Islands?
Yeah, there's this amazing sugar database which you can find online if you literally just write sugar refining database, and it's a local historian called Brian Moore, and he has tracked as much archaeological evidence as you can find for sugar refining. So yes, there's sugar refiners in John Stow's survey of London, the account book I mentioned, which talks about lead. It's 1617. There are some legal disputes about refiners, for instance, there's a Dutch refiner who comes in to London in the early 17th century, and he wants to practice, and people are getting upset because they think it's a foreigner coming in, taking our jobs. That kind of seems like that kind of narrative comes up. So there are refiners. I don't think that they are. The growth is definitely post 1650. The number of people, especially a geography which spread, like I showed in that map, across the country, is after the expansion of the industry. And sorry, I've forgotten the second part of the question.
And it was, were sugar refiners in England during the early 17th century getting their sugar from Brazil and the Atlantic?
Yes. So you could, when you break down those 1660s trade figures by country, you can see that some was coming from the Caribbean, yes, at that point, but also some was still coming from Portugal, and then also sugar came via Dutch Brazil, but either via Portugal or via Antwerp and Amsterdam, those refiners I talked about earlier. So sugar was coming from international sources that would basically, it would come through Europe to England rather than from English islands or British islands.
Lovely. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Michael. Amanda Bevan asks, did the existence of byproducts such as molasses from English refining create new opportunities, for example, in terms of rum and the Navy?
Yes, definitely. And I think that there is a kind of tension with rum and molasses as to where it happens. Sometimes the rum gets shipped up, the molasses gets shipped up to North America, and then the rum is made in North America and then shipped back to Europe and also to Africa to be used as a method of exchange or a medium of exchange in taking enslaved people back across to the Caribbean. But rum does become much more foundational to kind of English industry, but at a later date. So it's not until the mid 18th century that rum takes off. And you can't actually see instances of rum. These account books that I was using, you don't actually see instances of rum being shipped. It hasn't been kind of solidified or considered to be a proper drink. And it's not until French that you have to stop importing French brandy because of the Napoleonic Wars that the British start to create their own domestic liquor.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Mimi. Hope that answers things, Amanda. Alexander's got another one here. He asks, were Caribbean molasses distilled into rum on British soil as it was in North America?
I don't... sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. Were Caribbean molasses distilled into rum on British soil as it was in North America?
Yes. Caribbean molasses. Actually, Caribbean molasses from both British islands and French islands and Spanish islands would be shipped up to North America. If it was not British molasses, it was smuggled in. It was then refined or used to distill to make rum in colonial English America. I think that makes sense.
That helped, Alexander. Thank you. Clodagh Tate asks, could you say more on the links between distilling and sugar refining, please? And she says, in Cork, it seems to be some of those involved in the sugar trade refining had links with the trade in beer and whiskey. And is it that there are some overlaps in equipment and skills? Yeah, I was also thinking about this myself in connection with brewing, for example.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think that the example I gave earlier suggests that there's a guy in Lancashire who's a friend with the stout roaster that I talked about, who has a stake in a wine distilling industry and what goes on to be a rum distilling industry in Liverpool, and also is involved in sugar refining. So I think that you would, because those copper stills they're called stills because they also distill. So I don't think there would be necessarily an overlap in the actual location, as in I don't think they're using the same stills to create both rum and refining sugar, but the whole industry, which is involved in boiling large amounts of sugary liquid, is similar. And yes, but I think that compared to sugar refining in North America, which happens on North American, on British North American soil, is much more about refining, distilling molasses to make rum than it is about refining sugar. It's the refining of sugar happens much more in Europe and in England specifically.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. I hope that answers things, Clodagh. Moving on, Mark Hailwood says really impressive and interesting paper. Thank you. The sugar refining industry seems to be very masculine, and he wonders if there are any parts of the process that were typically seen as women's work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would love to write more about gender, and I do write about gender in North America because you can see women are much more involved in the immediate trading of sugar and the participation of sugar and kind of spreading sugar around the North American economy. It has seemed to be strikingly masculine, the records I found, and I would love to say that I could see an instance which was a specifically women's work. What seems to happen is that women just end up being the ones writing the recipe books that use the sugar and are important for its circulation, kind of domestic circulation, actually literally into our bodies or into historical actors' bodies. I haven't been able to find or seen many women involved in it. If anyone knows of any women in sugar refining, please tell me, because I would love to know more about them.
Fantastic. I hope that answers things, Mark. Janet Pennington has a note. She says, quickly looking at my PhD on inns and taverns, which I've read, and it's brilliant, from 2003, she notes 3 references to sugar in probate inventories, 2 in town inns, references to sort of sugar dishes and sugar pots.
Yeah.
Sugar pots in a small coastal inn in 1706. And she says a wider spread of inventories might show a pattern of sugar use in hospitality. So that's perhaps more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, no, and I think hospitality is an interesting, and I didn't talk about it here, but there are these amazing. If you ever look at I often use household accounts to think about how people were eating sugar, and often you can see little receipts that they've taken when they've gone from place to place. They've gone up to London, or they've gone down to London, or they've gone to Liverpool, and they have a record of the food that they consumed en route, and you can see sugar is purchased with the breakfast, with the lunch for their servants. So you can definitely see it's being used in these kind of rural environments, and also that it would be an expected form of, you'd expect to be able to eat it on the road, whereas you might, like now we're like, okay, I'm going traveling, probably only going to get a rubbish sandwich on the way. Sugar was basically something that was deemed as normal and necessary.
Lovely, thank you, Janet. And Mark's just mentioned in the comments that, of course, the highly masculinized sort of nature of sugar refining does, of course, contrast with with the brewing.
Yeah.
So Neska Pfeiffer asks, if more refining is taking place in England, how is this changing how the sugarcane is getting produced in the islands and colonies? Does it have any sort of impact over there? Yeah,
well, what is interesting is if you contrast it with Portugal and Portuguese policies and Dutch policies, is that Portugal actually slightly earlier on bans refining in Portugal itself, and says you basically, in order to encourage industrial activity in our colonies, we're not going to refine sugar on the Portuguese mainland. England say, no, we want industrial activity happening at home, so we're going to have these preferential rates of taxation, which I talked about, and that means that people get very upset about the amount of money that they can make in the plantation, because they say it's ruining them, it's ruining their economic livelihoods. So less of the kind of further stages, less of those knocking rooms, which where the clade sugar that creates white sugar happens, or rather maybe not less, but kind of it doesn't develop in the same way, and more just kind of simple sort of basic processing happens at the point of production. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Nezka. Charlie Taverner says, thanks, Mimi. He's he's intrigued by what you said about the coal used in refining and also the impacts on landscape. Yeah, I was also sort of thinking that about in relation to Will Cavett's work, and he wonders what fuel were they using for the early stages of the process on plantations? Would it have been wood from the island in the absence of coal?
Yeah, so it is wood, and it carries on being wood, and that's obviously really important for the link between North America timber production and the Caribbean. So it still continues to be wood in the earlier process. Coal is used extensively in England, even in those very early, the early 17th century account books. You can see that they're going and still trying to get coal. So, but coal increase just goes up as more and more refineries. Coal use goes up as more refineries spring up too. But yeah, in the Caribbean, it's wood.
Fantastic, thank you, Mimi. Hope that helps, Charlie. My goodness, it's a who's who of food and drink history in the question and answers box. Sarah Pennell asks, says, please ignore the connection if you dealt with it in the main talk. But she says, has archaeological evidence been helpful in terms of citing material cultures of refining in London and elsewhere?
Yes, definitely. There's a really fantastic article, and I'm going to forget who the name of it, but it's in. I'll email you the article. It's just completely gone out of my mind. But yeah, she talks about the different pots available, and the fact that actually there were different refining practices which would still use Iberian pottery, even though sugar was no longer being shipped in from Portugal, but you'd still use the eventual pottery to store the sugar that was then going forward. So yeah, material culture is really useful, and to actually think about mostly these refineries which I've tracked don't exist anymore. There's little and it's really about archaeological evidence which suggests that they exist there, as well as situating them near to glass houses, near to soap boilers, because if you didn't then, and having the sense that there was this industrial zone, which basically has all been created from people's archaeological research that I've just plundered.
Excellent, thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Sarah. Janet Pennington's just got a quick follow-up comment here. It's that sugar, of course, used to sweeten wine. Shakespeare, full of references. She says, great talk. Mark Jenkins, this is more something for Janet, I think, is the study just mentioned on INS. This is Janet Pennington's 2003 study, available on PDF. I'm not sure, I can't remember how I accessed it, but perhaps, Janet, you can advise in the comments box. Phil Withington says, thanks, Mimi. He says, Williams has probably attracted more controversy for arguing the economic causes of the abolition of slavery, and he wonders whether you engage with this aspect of his narrative, i.e. towards the end of the 18th century, from the perspective of sugar refiners.
I don't, mostly because my thesis is already too big, but it is very interesting. And I had, I think what happens later in the 18th century is that England continues to produce sugar for its own market, but it stops exporting sugar. It kind of does close down a bit, and the French start to be the most kind of important sugar producers or exporters in Europe. So I haven't thought about that, but I will. Thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, brilliant. We've got a little bit of time, so I will just slip in one myself, not perhaps specifically relating to refining, but obviously the story of sugar is traditionally told in connection with that of caffeinated beverages, coffee and tea, and presumably your sort of narrative of bringing things forward, you're complicating that sort of perceived sort of insoluble relationship a little bit.
Yes, yeah, I am 100%. That is a very, very key part of my thesis. And I think that what I show is by looking at these hugely various amount of source material, is that you see that sugar is basically just kind of a normal thing. It's sort of everywhere. It's the way that it gets criticized for existing everywhere now. You know, it's in cake, it's in beer, it's in wine, it's it's sort of ubiquitous. And the thing that I didn't talk about so much today, because I was interested in refining, is that actually, because more brown sugar is coming into the country, not all of it is refined. A lot of it just stays as brown sugar, which is much cheaper, which means that more and more people can have access to it. And so it's not just about wealthy people eating white sugar that they sort of have a little lump and it goes in their expensive tea. It really is across the board, is consumed across the board in small amounts, yes, but it is widely available, even much earlier than tea, and the concomitant and the drop in price of tea in the 17 teens. It's much earlier. And the argument that I think is an interesting one to make is that because all of these early beverages were sweetened, you would drink wine with sugar, and you would drink beer, and beer would be brewed with sweetened forms. You'd have cider that was sweet. You'd have possets, which were sweet. When a bitter drink comes into England, its consumers want to sweeten it. That is, in the same way that we all drink sugar because it's everywhere and we want to drink more of it. That same narrative could be applied to kind of the uptake of caffeinated drinks.
And Sarah Pennell points out in comments, of course, the many various medicinal uses, evidence collections. And
it's definitely seen to be an important element of anything that's medicinal, and I think that's a very key early use for it, which slightly goes out of fashion, but also I think that possibly might be to do with changing medicinal practices rather than actually sugar being kind of cut out as a deliberately cut out, but that's a whole other issue.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. And the question box has fallen silent. So sort of speak now or forever hold your peace. I think we've given Mimi quite a grilling already, and the witching hour is approaching. So I think, particularly with a project finance meeting looming, we'll wrap things up here. But it remains for me to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
For a fascinating talk. It really was great. And best of luck for the final straight of the people, which, again, as with Lila's, we're all itching. So just a quick note to say our next seminar is 2 weeks today, on Wednesday the 9th of December, when Jim Mills from the University of Strathclyde will be speaking on opiates and pain in early modern Scotland. Do register via Crowdcast. I've just put the little link up. And yes, do watch this space. We are putting the finishing touches to a second season of What's Your Poison, which will include Elizabeth Grass's talk on tea, which we had to cancel. So yeah, more details to be announced. But thanks everyone. Thanks Mimi. Cheerio. See you in a
Thank you very much. Thanks.